make sure you have a process, make sure you have a pricing committee. It sounds so like condescending and pedantic because you're like, well, I don't need a committee, right? But pricing is, as you kind of alluded to, it's at the intersection of important and uncomfortable. And whenever you have that happen, those are things that get deprioritized inside an organization constantly.
Coffee's for closers only.
So we've established my proposal is sound in principle. Now we're just haggling over price.
Let's see how much we're going for on eBay.
It's the same as Dunkin' Donuts. Costs 15 times the price.
Welcome to Impact Pricing, the podcast where we discuss pricing, value, and the recurring relationship between them. I'm Mark Stiving. Today our guest is Patrick Campbell. Here are 3 things you want to know about Patrick before we start. He is founder and CEO of ProfitWell, which used to be called Price Intelligently. He's co-host of the Pricing Page Teardown, and I love that show. And he has access to more subscription data than probably anybody else in the world. Welcome, Patrick.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm glad you're a fan. We made it for pricing folks, and hopefully other people watch it too, because there's not a lot of us out there.
Yeah, there are not. So a couple of years ago, I was teaching pricing for a living, and I got into this subscription thing, and I said, well, I got to study this and figure, actually, to be really embarrassing, in class, people would ask me, how does this relate to subscription? And I'd always say there's no difference. Right? So go back a couple of years. Yeah, it's always about willingness to pay and value.
That's right. Exactly.
But go back a couple of years, and when I decided I was going to get into it, you were one of the people that I studied constantly. Right? I've probably read so much of your material, seen so many of your videos. You are like a guru to me. Now, there are others too, but you are absolutely a guru. So thank you very much.
Yeah. I'm embarrassed you say that because I study so much still. So I feel like, as they say, the more you know, the less you feel like you know anything. So
yeah, the more you know you don't know. So
that's right.
Absolutely. So how did you get into pricing in the first place?
Yeah, it's a good question. I actually had a little bit of a circuitous path to that because my background's in econometrics and math, and so I did more like econ modeling. And so I worked for the government and the intelligence community, then at Google, kind of doing that with numbers for some sort of outcome. And I then ended up working at a company as a D2C, so direct-to-consumer company that was in the jewelry space. It was a startup. They're basically a competitor to Blue Nile. And I started working for them as just kind of like an analyst, essentially. And one of the things that they threw to me was basically pricing. And I was kind of like an entry-level plus kid at this point. So wasn't a big salary, wasn't a big, not a lot of confidence maybe in me as much. And so I kind of started putting 2 and 2 together of, hey, this is something that is super important. And when we would make changes, we would see these big just gains in revenue or losses in revenue, depending on the change, but they gave it to some kid. And so there's probably a little bit of a disconnect here in order to jump in and care about it. And so I kind of fell in love with it because I think that I'm a big fan of, what you were talking about in the intro there around, getting to value and getting to, kind of the essence of what matters. And I think pricing, not to sound poetic, but it really does get to the essence of what you're doing as a business because you've created this value and now you're trying to find that exchange rate for the value. So yeah, that's kind of what led me to this. And I'm glad I found it and I'm not just some, boring salesperson somewhere, I guess.
Isn't it incredible how so many companies don't value pricing? They don't think it's important.
I think it's more, it's interesting because you say important there. And I think that a lot of people understand its importance. Like, I think if you went up to anyone and you were like, hey, like, do you think your pricing is important? Like, no one's going to say no, right? Because they had some class, in school from someone like you who was like, hey, this is really important. I think what ends up happening is they don't realize the leverage they get from it. And I think that the reason they don't, especially in maybe the subscription space, but also I'd argue any business that's relied heavily on the internet, which is now all of us, you have this beautiful moment in time from kind of like 2001 to probably 2015 where, costs of doing business just kept going down. So you could ship more features, ship more stuff. And then all of a sudden, all these channels kept opening up. So you were able to acquire more users at a cheaper price. Google AdWords, a penny a click. You wrote an ebook that was kind of like just a blog post, and you were looked at as a god just because there wasn't a lot of content out there, these types of things. And so what ended up happening is you basically just had this phenomenon where you didn't need pricing leverage, right? And what we've noticed, I don't know if you've noticed this, I'd be curious your opinion, is that basically now that acquisition it's not dried up, but it's getting more competitive. It's denser. We haven't had a major new marketing channel since 2015. Or I guess TikTok will be the new one here at some point. But basically, we now have to look to things like repeat purchases or retention, or we have to look at things like monetization. I think it's just people are evolving, their businesses are evolving, and they're going to the path of least resistance, which is a very human thing. So yeah, I think that's kind of my take on why it's not as seriously taken as it probably should be.
Yeah, I was playing off the fact that you as a kid were given this important role of pricing.
Yeah.
And yet when you go talk to companies, they don't have great pricing departments, they don't have great pricing strategies. And you're absolutely right. It's so important.
Yeah, but you'll notice when they get, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
That's okay.
When they get, there you go.
Good. No, you go.
I was going to say, when you get big enough, though, I mean, you've probably seen this as well. With a lot of companies, as soon as they reach, I don't know, some it's like 75 million, some it's 100 million, but or they have multiple products, all of a sudden they'll have someone dedicated to pricing. They might not be called a pricing person, but they're kind of the one who's in charge of it at least. And I think that it's kind of funny how I think that threshold will come down over time. And I think in addition to that, I don't know if there'll actually be a pricing department until there's a lot more complexity. I think what will end up happening is it'll sit under product or sit under marketing, kind of where it started as well.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. And the thing that frustrates me about pricing is that many companies think pricing is how much am I going to charge for my product.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you think about what you do and what I talk about all the time, it's really about the value and how do you put together the right packages and how do you choose the right pricing metrics and how do you choose the right market segments. There's all these really important decisions around value that I think of as pricing, but companies don't.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because I think it becomes the amorphous nature of value, right? That's a word, I can't touch it, right? My price I can touch. I can be like, oh, that's $9 or that's $50 or whatever it is. But what I like to talk about, and I think it's a good mental model for people, is that, the exchange rate metaphor I already started using, right? Your price is the exchange rate. Now, there's so many things that can affect that exchange rate, right? Who you sell to is going to affect that exchange rate, what you sell, how you package what you sell, the positioning, all these different things. And then, of course, the price, right? So, you and I have been on a similar journey the past number of years of, convincing people, one, the stuff's important, but then also educating them on, hey, like this is something that is not only important, but it has so many different levers that you should be treating this very similar to your product development and your marketing development. And I think what's kind of fascinating is it's kind of like pet insurance. I think that, 10, 15 years ago, when you were, told to get pet insurance, you were kind of like, wait, what is this? Right. And unless you had a major issue, you basically didn't know this existed unless someone told you should have it. Right. Now you're looking at a world where, pet insurance, like you wouldn't have Fido without pet insurance because you'd be a terrible dog mom or dad, right? And I think eventually it's pricing. We're kind of in the middle there. There's a lot of people who are like, well, of course I need to take this seriously. Of course I need to do this. We got folks like you, preaching out there about, why this is so important. And I think we'll eventually get to a point because it'll just be so dense in the market that if you don't have someone focused on retention 24/7 and someone focused on monetization, you're just not doing your diligence as a business owner.
Yeah, that's spot on. Hey, let's talk about language for just a brief moment since you use retention and monetization. I always use the words win, keep, and grow. And just because I find them really easy and I can say them fast and over and over
I like
again.
that.
And I want to make sure that the listeners who listen to me all the time, when Patrick's saying monetization, he's actually talking about that expansion or the grow revenue bucket. I assume that's what you meant.
Yeah, it's a little bit of the way I look at my mental model is acquire, monetize, retain, right? So that's, the pricing folks, we all got our models and our frameworks.
Gotta have them.
It fits with the subscription world because, acquire conceptually, people are like my ads, my content, my sales team, etc. I think that there's obviously monetization elements in there, and then monetize is not only the point of conversion and how they come in, but also how they grow, at least in my mind. And then retain, yeah, it mixes a little bit because there's some of the monetize in there as well, but it's about making sure that they stick around into the long term. So that's kind of how I think about it. So the win, keep, and grow, like the win would probably be the acquisition there. The keep would probably be the retention, and grow would be monetized. So yeah, that's the Mark to Patrick exchange rate basically there.
Yeah, exactly. So there's one more that I gotta talk about, and I only do this because everybody I talk to that knows you, I say, could you please ask Patrick to stop using these words? Now I know you won't, but I'm gonna say it to your face if that's okay.
That's fine. I actually don't know what this is, so I'm surprised. I'm ready to go.
So you and I use the words pricing metrics and value metrics to mean the same thing. And I use those two words very differently. So I think of a pricing metric as what do we charge for? What does our company charge for?
Yeah.
I think of a value metric as how does my customer measure the value of what I'm delivering to them? And in my ideal world, my value metric and my pricing metrics are highly correlated with each other. Mm-hmm. But and so often I talk to people and they're using the word value metric and I say, oh, so you watch ProfitWell stuff. They're like, yeah.
That's awesome. Well, maybe not awesome, but it's just funny. That's interesting. I think, I'm going to have to think on that one. Because I think value metric, like the way I would translate, like value metric to me, I think about that as ideal, and like there's ideal value metrics and there's like pragmatic value metrics. So that's how I would square what you're describing as the difference between pricing and value. I'm basically bucketing those all in one thing. And then there's a usage metric element because we're in the world of subscriptions as well as SaaS. And so, yeah, that's interesting. I think that comes from Jim Geisman. I don't know if I'm sure you know Jim or you've heard of Jim. Yeah. And then also from Skok, the big
David
Skok.
Yeah.
I always get him and his brother because they sound and look very similar, and I'm always like, I'm going to get David or Michael. I'm going to mix them up. But yeah, they're in Boston. I can't remember the firm's name, but he always talked about the value metric in this way, and then I think it evolved from just like the past academic part into like being a little bit different. So I'll think on that one. Pricing metrics are a little more concrete as well. So yeah, we'll think on it.
I figure with your 100 years of content that you've got built into your company at this point, it's going to be tough to change that.
No, we're not. We like to go for truth though, right? Like, so whatever works better, that's what we kind of focus on. And so if we notice, for instance, that it's better for us to, like people can, if they can grasp on pricing metric versus value metric better to mean the whole concept of setting up how you're going to charge, we would switch in a heartbeat. So we'll probably do a little micro study on this and come out with what we're going to end up doing.
Okay, cool. Let me know so I could see.
Yeah, it'd be cool.
Hey, let's talk some of the things that I always struggle with that I'm just curious about your opinion. What do you think of companies like, let's say, Uber? Now, Uber isn't officially a subscription company, but they depend a lot on the same recurring revenue that all subscription companies care about. And you would almost call them, we're just going to use a usage-based pricing metric. Mm-hmm. So would you call them a subscription company? How do you make that sense in your mind?
I think that so there's a couple of fun things to talk about there. So for one, they do have a subscription now. So at least some of their revenue is subscription, like a very pure subscription. I think of these as recurring revenue businesses. I think the evolution is going to go from one-time purchases to subscription purchases to recurring revenue businesses. And this is, there's obviously transitions where everything goes back and forth and things like that. But the reason is because if I was in Uber's shoes as like an economic analyst or something like that, I could actually look at, for a certain user, what is my like recurring revenue, right? And it'll fluctuate depending on what's going to happen, but what's the revenue that I can expect from you on a periodic basis? And basically all you're doing, and I do think this is the future of most businesses, it's just going to take a while to get there. But I do think what's essentially happening is I am putting the onus of the term from my customer to the business, right? So the term is interesting, right? Because there's a lot of implications for monetization as well as retention. But for me, when I'm trying to calculate my recurring revenue, I'm not forcing that monthly purchase on my customer. I'm just measuring their usage essentially within a period and then putting an artificial report of like, hey, this is what our monthly recurring revenue looks like. And it's not unlike most like cash flow models that already kind of exist out there. I just think we're going to conceptualize it a little bit differently as businesses go to this point of like not trying to lock someone to a actual term, but basically just measuring what they use within a term.
Yeah, it's actually kind of interesting because if you think about it, Coke is just like Uber, right? Where I want you to buy and drink Coke every week, but we wouldn't think of them as a subscription business.
Well, I'm sure that they have, there isn't the tie the difference there is like, I can't measure it, right? Because you might get your Coke from Kroger every single week or every single month, or you might get it from, the 7-Eleven, or you might get it from wherever. And so they probably, if they wanted to put enough effort into it, they probably could model an actual recurring revenue like model. I mean, the street, like Wall Street wouldn't believe in the compounding nature of the recurring revenue or anything like that. But I think the difference is Uber has like the actual connection to a high usage. Like they can measure the usage perfectly, essentially.
Yes.
So I think that's kind of the difference. But I think that as we get, interestingly enough, as our billing systems get better, and that's the biggest constraint here, basically we're going to be able to measure this more and more. And then with that data, basically make it so that we get to value in almost as perfect a way as possible, which I think is what the future looks like, which means not having to tie you into a specific term, but basically saying, hey, like this is what the usage metric looks like, and go on from there.
Yeah, in some ways it feels like going pure usage is going backwards. Not completely by any means, but in some ways. And one of the reasons why companies or people like buying subscriptions is we have a guaranteed price, right? I know how much I pay Netflix. I pay them this every month. I don't have to pay them a different amount if I watch more movies, or right, it's here's your $12. Right?
Yeah.
Leave me alone. And so I think in a lot of cases, we like the predictability of the expense.
Yeah, I think it's going to go away though with some things. I think when you're talking about something like Netflix, right, which is it like, so if you think about a retention, like we always think about like features or value metrics in our definition, at least pricing metrics, I should say, that correlate or amplify to higher retention versus lower retention, right? So if I have a marketing product, all things being equal, let's just say a generic marketing automation product, I actually don't want to do users because that's going to diminish the number of people who are in there, and the higher level or higher value pricing metric is probably contacts, right? So when I look at something like Netflix, I don't want to get in front of that usage. So I don't want to charge per movie, right? But I might have, some sort of large bank of movies you can watch in an unlimited manner. And then like Disney Plus recently did with Mulan, I might have these one-offs where I can pay essentially to get it sooner, right? I can pay for it to be within the first 3 months. And then from there, I can go so on and so forth. But I think where you're going to have more need for usage metrics is that we've at least seen in the enterprise, there's been a softening of variable pricing, because there's been more of an importance, especially this year, given obviously everything that's been happening, that they want more of like, I only want to pay for what I'm using. I don't want to go buy the SAP contract that has 4,000 seats, and I'm just going to renew the contract because 300 people are using it, but I'm going to have to pay for all 4,000 in year 4. I don't want to do that anymore. I just want to like pay for what's needed. And I think that is going to outweigh the predictability like relatively soon as the accounting and ERP systems get better at being able to recognize this stuff. But I don't think like you're going to end up paying. I know there are some people who believe you're going to pay per listen on Spotify. I think it's a terrible user experience. So I just don't think it's going to happen. But there might be some very consumptive or usage-based things like, hey, you're going to pay for every squeeze of toothpaste, akin to like Black Mirror. I don't know if you saw that episode, or you're going to pay for just the usage of whatever you're using. And I think that's better for the customer. So I think inevitably we'll get there.
So that leads me to the question, can you separate pricing and packaging? Because it seems like they're so tightly related in everything we've talked about so far.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, based on how I would define the terms, I think that, well, So price being, I guess it's going to depend on how we define the terms here. Like in my mind, when I look at something like packaging, there's a lot of things I can do with packaging that have very little to do with the actual number, right? So I can move features around theoretically. If you want to loop positioning, well, not a lot of people loop positioning into packaging, so I won't do that. But I can move things out to become add-ons. There's a whole host of things that I can do. But yeah, I would say that there are things you can do independent of pricing or independent of each other with pricing and packaging that leads to essentially, different optimizations. So I think that you can work with them to get without each other, but there's a lot that they rely on with one another. So it gets a little more complicated.
Yeah, I think I could agree with that in that it's possible to do some things without really paying attention to pricing. But I also think that once you start thinking about the two together, they become so much more powerful.
Oh, 100%. Totally.
And the third one that I would throw in there is market segments, right? If we could start creating market segmentation and certain packages for certain market segments, now we really are capturing value.
100%. And I think that's where you're going to go, right? I don't think you're going to have pure dynamism anytime soon, but I think you'll start seeing segment-based pricing sooner than later, where and a lot of companies already do this, right? Like obviously massive retail giants, like a Hallmark, for instance, or Starbucks, like their prices are different across the country depending on urban, suburban, high density, low density, these types of things. But I do think that there's going to be a move to some dynamism, which means you might have, let's say 20 different plans, right? But as a customer or prospect, I'm only ever going to see 2 or 3, right? Because you're going to somehow know and drive me to the right landing page, or based on some sort of recognition, you're going to be able to see that I came from SEO versus from Facebook. And therefore SEO, I know my LTV is better. So I'm okay or my retention is better. So I'm okay taking a little bit of a lower price and, these types of things. But I think the tooling is what needs to get, supercharged to even make this happen. But if we don't dream about it and don't think about when it's going to come or how we can do it with the tools we have, we'll never develop the tools that make it seamless.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the tools we have, could you tell us about what is the base free offer that you guys give at ProfitWell X Price Intelligently?
Yeah, we do. We have freemium, which I know is controversial in pricing communities. So I actually was very against freemium. Then I became a bit of a freemium zealot. So I've been on all sides of this issue. But basically what we did, and since you have a pricing audience, I'll go into a couple more details than normal, just because it's just not interesting to other people normally, is that we just found the willingness to pay for the product was terrible. Just terrible, right? And it's an analytics product. So you plug in your billing system like Zora, Stripe, Braintree, whatever you're using, and then we give you access to your subscription financial metrics. And with that, we thought we were geniuses because we wanted a way to get better data, revenue data for our pricing product. But we also were talking to people who were like calculating these numbers completely incorrectly, like very large companies. And so we thought we were smart, and then we did pricing research, and we discovered, people don't like paying for analytics products. It's a really tough industry to be in unless you're niche or if you go up market. So we had the decision of we could do freemium, we could go up market, or we could go niche, and it was already niche with subscription companies, so that wasn't really an option. And we chose the freemium, or we could kill the product, but we chose the freemium route for a lot of reasons. But what was interesting about it is that I always say this, so you probably heard this before, Mark, but basically you got to treat it like a premium ebook. It's an acquisition model. It's not a pricing model. Now, true pricing people are like, no, of course, freemium is part of the pricing model. And yes, I get that. But it's one of those things when you're talking to people who aren't even pricing properly, you got to kind of give them a little bit of a different metaphor.
So let me pause for just a second. And then remember where you are so you can continue. But when I first heard you say the words, freemium is a customer acquisition model, not a pricing model, I loved that. And by the way, I still do. And the reason for that is because it changes your mindset, right? Because that's what it really is. It's really all about how do I go win customers who are going to pay me money.
Yep. Well, and it comes down to what is the metric that the tactic is influencing, right? And this is why I'm a big believer with monetization that you should really be looking at your revenue per customer, right? And you might measure that ARPU, ACV, ARPA, like a whole host of things. But I think that the big thing you have to think about with freemium is it's opening the top of the funnel. So if it's opening at the top of the funnel, it's not something, it is something that will influence your pricing, but it's not part of your pricing strategy's core, if that makes sense. It's part of your acquisition strategy's core. So yeah, that's what we ended up doing. And it's been successful because we get two effects that come from it. One, there's a network effect, because every time we get more data, it goes into our algorithms of our pricing or retention products and these sorts of things that makes them better. But the other thing it does is it lowers our CAC, our customer acquisition costs, quite significantly. And we were a little bit worried, and we did face some scrutiny with like very large companies, because very large companies, one, hooking up their revenue data, like that's, tough in and of itself. But then in addition to that, a free product, it gets a little bit dubious, right? And I think we went from, and you know this probably better than anyone, we went from a world of like freemium being a thing, like freeware was a huge thing in the 80s and 90s, to all of a sudden being this like, well, if it's free, you must be selling my data, to all of a sudden this world of like, no, there are other models besides ads and selling data. Like I can use this as that acquisition tool. And so, yeah, so that's been something that we've been on for quite some time. That's worked out really, really well for us, especially given our market dynamics, which we have a low logo market. So, there's only about 150,000 subscription companies in the world. And that's if, we're being very generous. It includes media, subscription e-commerce, SaaS, et cetera. And when you're in a low logo world, you have a requirement to get as many of those logos inside your sphere of influence as possible. And the best way to do that, content as well as through, some sort of freemium product. And so that's kind of the path we took. I don't know if we were that prescient when we were coming out with this, whether that's some post hoc analysis, but yeah, it definitely worked out.
Doesn't everybody pivot and figure it out on the way?
Yeah, well, that's the game, man. Exactly.
That's the game. So here's what I like about your freemium model. I actually don't think of it as freemium the way I think of most things as freemium. Right. So one of my favorite companies, LinkedIn, true freemium. I sign up for a free account, and then maybe I pay them more money so I get more access. But I think of your freemium as I get this free product, and then you now have the ability to look at my data and say, Mark, do you realize that you're having a retention problem? Let me come help you with your retention problem. Do you realize you're having a payment problem? Let me come help you with your payment problem. Right? And so it's almost like you've offered me this huge value up front, and then in exchange for that, I'm giving you the opportunity to find my problems for me and sell me solutions to my problems.
Yeah, the way we kind of look at freemium is there's kind of two or three types depending on how you want to cut it. There's the faux free trial, which is kind of an access deal, where you give 100 visits or 100 what's it per month. And then as soon as that person goes to 101, hopefully if it's your target segment, it's 2 to 3 weeks into the month, then you're forced to convert or forced to wait until the next month. And that can be also feature differentiated. We're doing what we call basically forever free, which is you provide a ton of value to the group you're going after. And it's not a smart strategy unless you get a network effect from either data, word of mouth, et cetera, which, thankfully we get both, or you get what you're talking about. We call it creating the requirement, right? Where we're basically, once you hook up, we have these triggers and they're not intrusive. You can still use the product forever for free and get a ton of value. But we have these different triggers of like, hey, you see this number, like, I don't know if you know this, but that number should be this, a lower number. And if you want that number to be lower, like click this button and we can set up a call or we can get you hooked up to the product. So yeah, it's interesting. It's definitely one of those things where I think if I had to do it all over again, which is always a dangerous statement, I think that we still would have gone freemium, but I think we would have gone about it in a little bit of a different path. I think we would have gone enterprise first, not with the metrics product, but with the other products we knew were coming. And then we would have gone freemium, because it's going, everything I've heard about go to market with kind of, your segment selection is you either want to go high and then come down, or you want to go low and then go up, right? If you want to go in the middle and kind of go out, it's very expensive because you're just constantly getting nibbled at the edges of, a whole host of things, price, packaging, marketing, all these different things. And I think we kind of chose a low go up model, but we also had our price intelligently product, which is already up, right? It's not $50 a month, so it was one of those things that gets really interesting to kind of look back. But I think, in the end of the day, we're doing well. And so I can't complain, of course. These are all champagne problems.
Yeah, exactly. It's okay. It's okay. Patrick, this is just so much fun. We're going to have to start wrapping up though, but what's one piece of pricing advice you give our listeners that you think could have a big impact on their business?
Great question. Pragmatically, the pricing metric, I'll use your terms on your podcast.
Thank you.
I would say that is probably the most powerful thing you can do. If you get that right, like I like to say, if you get that right and get everything else not completely wrong, but still a little wrong, you'll be okay. But I think that even more pragmatically, and maybe I'm preaching to the choir here because of your audience base, make sure you have a process, make sure you have a pricing committee. It sounds so like condescending and pedantic because you're like, well, I don't need a committee, right? But pricing is you kind of alluded to, it's at the intersection of important and uncomfortable. And whenever you have that happen, those are things that get deprioritized inside an organization constantly. Or, you didn't talk to Joe in sales and now Joe is going to make you do another 8 weeks of conversations in order to implement something that you just have all the data on, right? But if you have that committee and it's made up of the main stakeholders or the main troublemakers, I like to say, and you also have a bit of a process and agreement that like, hey, we're going to make changes every 3 months, not raising prices necessarily, but like changing something about the monetization, that tends to be like the thing that separates companies that make this core competency versus those who don't. So that's probably the big thing besides that metric.
Yeah. The other reason I love the idea of the committee is, look, pricing touches finance and sales and marketing and product management and engineering, everybody and executives, don't forget them, right? Yeah. Everybody in the company cares about pricing and has an opinion. And if we don't have an opinion, we're never going to make any progress. Or if we don't have a committee, we're not going to make any progress. So. Totally.
And it gets, the troublemakers is the biggest thing. That's the biggest thing I learned, because early on, as like an external company coming and, helping people with pricing with our software and our expertise, it's like, it's one of those things where you don't realize like, oh, it's the data. The data will like guide us. And yes, we're gonna have to make a decision because the data is rarely like, picture perfect. But I made a mistake where, we went and we were like, cool, we're gonna implement. And then we never included, the guy's name was Joe and he was the head of sales. So I reference him all the time. He doesn't know that. And he, and I thought he was just being a jerk, but it turns out I was like, well, he's worried about his numbers. He's worried about his job. And if he feels like this isn't going to work out because his sales team isn't going to be able to hit their numbers, that affects him a lot, right? And he didn't necessarily have like the best like arguments against the change, but he wasn't involved in the process. So I would also probably be uncomfortable if I felt that was that big of a change and I wasn't involved and I was the one who had to go implement it. So it was just a really good lesson where I don't think, the VP of sales or the head of sales should be the decision maker, but they should definitely be in the room, as should product finance, customer success if you had it, marketing, of course, and these types of things.
Yeah, nice. Patrick, thank you so much for your time today. If anybody wants to contact you, how can they do that?
Yeah, so LinkedIn is great. I post a lot there. I'm also at patrick@profitwell.com, so feel free to hit me up there as well. Just like Mark, we write and talk about this stuff a lot. So, hit us up if you have any questions to kind of start that journey and start that conversation.
Awesome. Episode 92 is all done. To our listeners, would you please leave us a review? I promise to read them. RWS01 left us a review titled Subscription Pricing Excellence. Probably one of the best subscription-based pricing podcasts you could ever hope to listen to. Subscribe for free. Whoever RWS is, thank you very much. Don't forget to join our Champions of Value community. It's absolutely free. You join it by going to community.championsofvalue.com. That's where we post all of our memes, blogs, videos, podcasts, anything I post for free. If you subscribe there, you'll be able to see it. If you have any questions or comments about the podcast or about pricing in general, feel free to email me at mark@impactpricing.com. Now, go make it impact.